In the warm, sunny seasons, we've many good reasons to get some garden work done. Planting seeds and pulling weeds, anything the good earth needs. Garden work is so much fun. Annuals, perennials, veggies and biennials. Garden work is so much fun. Hosta glades and apple trees, carrots, cukes and fresh sweet peas. Garden work is never done.
Hi, I'm Dr. Bob Olson, and I grow hostas. I've been growing hostas for 25 years, I think, and I grow a lot of them, over 300 in this yard. I actually have had more at one point, but I'm kind of downsizing now because I like to grow some other things too, like colorful perennials and annuals, which actually makes the hostas look a lot better. Anyway, I've gotten hostas from a number of sources and some from all over the world. I've been to Japan to look for them in the wilderness and bought them here locally, and I hope to tell you quite a bit about how to grow hostas, which ones you might be interested in, and what to do when you get them. Okay, hostas come in all different sizes. Some of them are as big as elephant ears, and other ones as tiny as a mouse ear. And as a matter of fact, some of them are called mouse ears. I grow them in all sizes. I can't have too many very big ones because I live in a city lot here. So over the years I've grown to appreciate and love the small ones a lot more because I can put more of them in the ground. They're a little tougher than the big ones in some ways because it's so hard to get them established sometimes. If you take a little tiny plant and put it in the ground, it has a very hard time getting started, particularly if it's a single division. So I've tried over the years to develop a pattern or a system, and my system is to take the small plant and grow it in a pot or a container for a year or two, and then put it in the ground. Let me show you an example here. I have two specimens of a plant called frosted mouse ears. One I got almost 2 years ago and have been growing in the ground, and the other I got just 2 months ago and have been growing in a pot. Let's take a look at them. This is the plant that's been growing for 2 years here, and you can see that some of the leaves are big, but it's still a single division, and the total amount of plant tissue is not very great. Here is the other specimen I got 2 months ago and grew in this little pot, giving it fertilizer and water as it needed. And you can see already it's 2 divisions, and this is going to be just an excellent little plant next year when I put it in the ground. I'm able to keep it in this pot all winter long because I bury the pot in the ground with just the crown showing and cover it with leaves so that it'll make it through the winter. Then in the next spring, I can dig up the pot and have all the roots intact and nicely put it in the ground. This is blue mouse ears. It's the most popular, or one of the most popular small plants in America. It's getting kind of big though. Sometimes I wonder if maybe we should call it blue rat's ears. There are others forms of it are smaller. There are a number of tiny plants, however. Here's one called Little J. That's considerably harder to grow because it has so much white in it. And this one I would surely recommend that you would grow in a pot or under some sort of controlled condition for quite a while before placing it in the ground. And even then I'd put it in the sweet spot in your garden where everything seems to grow well. Here's one called Dixie Chickadee. It's got green and white and actually little green lines through the leaves you can see. And I try to grow them with some small companion plants too. Here's some ajuga that grows next to it. In other spots of the garden I use other companion plants to set off the small ones. You need to keep them apart from their giant giant relatives, or they are just going to be overwhelmed. As you can see, this large plant Hypoleuca is next to it. If it were to grow much bigger, it would totally engulf these small neighbors. Hostas can take a lot more sun than you might think. Everybody talks about hostas growing as being shade plants, which means they will grow in the shade. It does not mean they love it in dark, dry places. As a matter of fact, the hostas like just as much light as you can give them and no more, so they don't burn. Now, I found out all of this stuff firsthand when the tree that used to grow here went down, and there were a lot of hostas growing underneath it. So something had to be done, and I really didn't want to move the hostas. They've been doing so well there for so long, so I left them. And we used Darwinian selection to determine which ones would stay. And some of them have tolerated virtually full sun for from sun up till sundown. The green one back there, which has a couple of flowers, is called nigrescens. It certainly tolerates full sun, and it looks even better with the thistle behind it, the Shasta daisies, and I can grow these oriental lilies right next to it, giving it fragrance sometimes during the year. There's a Joe Pye weed here to help set it off too. There's some very good combinations of colors to use with hostas too. Particularly the blues and golds go well together. There's one called Blue Ice next to a very brilliant gold one called Maui Buttercups. Both of them look better because they've got a wonderful big plant called Sagai behind them. There are also different ways in which the plants increase. Most of them just kind of grow by accretion or get bigger each year. But some of them grow by rhizomes, underground little runners, and new plants crop up next to them. And you can have a little grassy field of them practically. Look at the one over here called Vera Verde, which started as one little division about 15 years ago and has just spread to take over the entire area. I used to have a colorful border here of annual plants. I'd grow these waxy begonias, and they look very nice as a border of pink or white, depending what color I'd pick that year, all the way around. But the hostas grow bigger each year, and now I can't have a border like that. This is an isolated plant left here for a little bit of color. As you can see, they've grown to encroach on the grass in several areas. More than that, there used to be twice as many plants here. I took out every other one until I was down to these. And at this point, I'm kind of reluctant to remove very many more, because these are some very nice big specimens. And of course, if you take them out, what are you going to do with them? I have to put them up for adoption. It's like having puppies. You have to find a good home for them. You can't just throw them on the compost heap after all these years of being a good friend. I like to get some color together with the hostas too. Otherwise, the garden tends to be awfully green and kind of dull. And annuals are a good way to go with that. Now, the natural thing is to try to grow some impatiens there, but there are problems with impatiens. One is the impatiens tend to grow awfully big towards the end of the summer and cover everything in sight. The second is impatiens can get kind of same old after a while. I find wax begonias are awfully good because they'll tolerate a lot of conditions, and more recently some of the Riger begonias have proved to be just excellent companion plants to grow with them. Now, once you start growing these hostas, you're going to get addicted to some other things too, like dwarf ferns. Fortunately, dwarf ferns are better to get addicted to because they aren't nearly so pricey. This is Adiatum venustum, a dwarf Himalayan fern, and it is just a wonderful companion for these plants. It's a little tough to get going, but once it goes, it's just dynamite. This is a very small fern, and it requires some covering in the winter to make sure it'll survive. Some other very fine things are the ajugas. Ajuga is a wonderful little foil for these dwarf hostas in particular. This is a Metallica called Metallica or a form of a metallica, and it never gets leaves that are very big. And you can see that this little tiny hosta here called Cameo is never going to be overpowered by this. Likewise, this Pixie Vamp looks wonderful with it too, and it's a nice contrast with this Peppermint Cream here too. Peppermint Cream is the name of this particular hosta. The one over there is named Karen. That's named for my wife. And it's one of the only hostas I've hybridized. Some of the best advice I got in gardening came from a fellow named Bob Savory, who was a member of the Men's Garden Club for many years, and he was a hosta expert. And he once told me, never put a $40 plant in a 50-cent hole. You're better off with a 50-cent plant in a $40 hole. And that's just excellent advice. Every year we add things to the soil here, and in particular we spread composted horse manure over the entire garden. And over the years the soil's gotten better and better. Here you can pick your hand in and clump it up and release it, and there's just a little moisture left over. And you'd like to get something like this all over your garden where you can just put your hand in it rather than have to dig with a trowel. One of the other secrets to good gardening for just about anything is to get your moisture and irrigation the way you'd like it to. And you can see here there's a soaker hose that goes around the crown of each plant. And this allows watering from below rather than from above, which accomplishes a couple of things. One is you use a lot less water, and second, you don't get water marks on the tops of the plants, which isn't important to most people, but if you're having a show garden and having people come by to inspect it with their white gloves, you don't want any marks at all on any of your plants. There are over 7,000 hostas listed in the most recent textbook, the Hostapedia by Mark Zillis. So you can see that they've pretty well branched out or pretty well run the gamut as to how many different variations they can do with blue and gold and green and white hostas. So the hot new things to do are to look at the backs and the petioles. And in particular, people are trying to develop hostas with white backs. The white back plants require a parent that has white backs, and there's only two sources of this in the world. Both are species plants from Japan. Behind me is Hosta hypoleuca. It grows in Japan in the rugged mountains. The only place it can be found is within 1 kilometer of the top of Mount Chichi-Iwa. You can see that the back is white. I got this plant in Japan and brought it back and grow it on the side of my little wall here, hoping it'll hang over and look like it did in its natural habitat in Japan. This plant is called John Wargo, and it has red petioles. It was one of the only plants we had with red petioles in America from which we could try to breed plants with this characteristic. Its ancestor came from Japan years ago, and the name of that plant was long forgotten. Here's a very unusual plant too. It's called praying hands, and it has these distorted leaves that come up that look folded and never unfold no matter how old the plant gets. This is an interesting one too. No one knows where it came from originally, but Jerry Williams in Edina, Minnesota found it in a nursery in Brainerd, Minnesota, and bought it from the owner who had no idea where it came from. People are always asking when they should divide their hostas, particularly when they say they've had them for 2 or 3 years and now it must be time to divide them. Well, that's not true. You don't have to divide a hosta ever. As a matter of fact, this one behind me is Golden Sculpture, and it's been untouched for 16 years, and it's doing fine. You will need to divide a hosta for only a few reasons. One is if you want to get more specimens of that type. 2, if you want to give it to a friend, that's a very good reason. And 3, if it's doing poorly and develops a fairy ring look in the center, then it's probably time to do something about it. But as long as it's growing well and all the crowns are coming up as a tight cluster in the spring, there's no reason why you have to divide them. People also ask about the flowers. Do I need to cut off the flowers? And if so, when should I cut them off? I know my daughter likes to cut them off as soon as they appear. I rather like the flowers though, and some of them can be attractive and some of them even are fragrant. You could cut the flower off at any time without harming the plant. I'm saving this flower only because I'd like to get some seeds from it to try to grow next winter. The, the one caveat about this would be don't cut the scape off when it comes up before the flower starts to open, or you'll just frustrate the flower and it'll keep sending up more and more scapes until one is allowed to flower. So let the flowers start to open and then cut the scapes off if that's what you'd like to do.
Fall cleanup is a chore for every gardener. You've spent the summer nurturing all your plants, and now they're dead or dormant. You think the work is over, but there are things you should do now to get the garden ready for next spring. An essential garden chore is dealing with leaves. They need to be removed to give your lawn the best possible start in the spring. You'll have more or less leaves depending on your yard, but it helps to have good tools to work with. This gardener, with a large lawn, uses a gas-powered backpack leaf blower to herd his leaves to the compost pile. Some gardeners don't compost leaves right away, but use them for winter protection of their garden beds. If you don't have that many trees, or the leaves aren't the right type for garden protection, you may need to acquire better leaves. This gardener obtains premium oak leaves from her neighbors and bags them in half-filled contractor bags to act as pillows to cover her perennial beds. She stores them under a big pine until the ground freezes and they can be put on the garden. Many perennials can be cut to the ground and then covered with the leaf bags to protect their roots. Perennials that can't be cut down, like this rose, are bent to the ground, anchored with a weight, and then covered by leaf pillows. This method also provides protection from winter-hungry rabbits who dine on rose canes. Another gardener grows some of his perennials in pots, and they need winter protection too. The first step is to bury them up to the rim of the pot. Other perennials, like these lilies, are dug and separated in the fall and then replanted. It's important to put a marker in the ground to show where the lilies will emerge in the spring. When the garden cleanup is complete, set your bags in an area without plants until the ground freezes. Then place them atop the plants that need protection. When the deep snows of winter come, your plants will have an extra blanket to keep them safe. But if it doesn't snow much, they'll still have enough cover. In the spring, remove the bags. Timing can be tricky. Sometimes there is still ice under the bags, and sometimes your plants will tell you when it's time to remove the bags. But don't wait too long or your plants could suffer the fate of this tulip. Finally, decide what you're going to do with your leaves. If you put them out for pickup by the city, new rules say they must be in compostable bags. Of course, you can always grind them up with your lawnmower or leaf shredder and make your own leaf mulch. Cutting back perennials in the fall is simple. This peony has gone dormant. Cut the stems about 1 inch above the ground, remove the cuttings, and discard them to prevent disease in the garden. Remove the peony hoops and cover the roots with bagged or unbagged leaves, depending on your preference. Some gardeners and some plants prefer no winter cover except that which falls from the sky. Those gardeners just clean out leaves and debris and let nature take its course. Raspberries don't need winter protection from the cold, but they do need a barrier to keep rabbits from eating the canes. Here's one way to do that. And some plants need to be left standing to provide some visual interest for the winter. There are cases when special care must be taken beyond just covering the plant. Hybrid tea roses, for instance, can be grown in Minnesota, but they need heavy-duty winter protection. The best way to provide that is the Minnesota tip method, demonstrated here by Doug Whitney. Again, good tools make for an easier job. A shovel to dig the trench, a fork for loosening the roots of the rose, and a non-rotting cord for tying. Step 1 is to do any necessary pruning and bind the canes to form a compact column. Now dig a trench from the base of the rose at least as long as the rose is tall. Loosen the soil around the root and gently tip the rose down into the trench. Cover with soil. After the ground freezes, roses appreciate a blanket of mulch. Here Doug uses straw to provide that extra layer of protection. And here's his rose bed, all ready for the snow that has begun falling. A number of evergreens, while they grow well here, can suffer from winter burn when exposed to the sun and drying winter winds. A good way to protect them is a burlap wrapping. Here some garden club members prepare evergreens for the winter at the Lindale Park Garden at Lake Harriet. They start by unrolling the burlap and spiraling it around the plant from the ground up. The top is closed and secured. The burlap is cut to the appropriate length, and the bottom is tucked in and fastened to the ground with earth staples. The last step is to overwrap the burlap with twine to prevent winter winds from undoing the protection. We've just shown you a small sample of ways to provide winter protection for your plants. Depending on what you grow and the conditions in your garden, you may use any number of variations of winter protection. Welcome to Ask the Experts. Our segment today, we're going to be talking about tree care with Nancy Bjerke, who's a member of the Men's Garden Club of Minneapolis, a master gardener, and a tree care advisor. What are the big issues in the tree world these days?
Well, the big issue is emerald ash borer, and they're not necessarily recommending you try to save your ash tree because it's coming, but they're recommending that plant the biggest tree you can in the yard if you have a chance, if you have enough space, and because the trees give off oxygen and we give off carbon dioxide and they take that in, so it's healthier for the environment if you can plant the big tree. And they do take longer, but if you could get one started now, that would be a good thing.
What are some of the trends in trees? I mean, there was a time when everybody was planting ash trees.
That's right.
To replace the elms that were going. So what should we be planting nowadays to be replacing those ash trees that, if they haven't been struck, are going to be struck?
Well, if you have a smaller area, you don't want to, of course, put in a great big huge oak. But the boulevard trees are usually taken care of by the city or the community. So they're placing a lot of Kentucky coffee trees, ginkgo trees, small trees that can handle the boulevards. But last year, I think it was in the late summer issue of Northern Gardener, they had a number of trees they recommended people try that are not usually seen as often up here. And one was the hemlock.
And is that a deciduous tree?
Deciduous it is a deciduous tree, but it has needles.
Okay.
And so people often say, well, I've had them tell me, well, that tree died in the winter. Well, it loses its needles. It is a deciduous tree, the hemlock. And the larch tree, that same thing, you know. And then the shagbark hickory, that's a nice tree. It's got very shaggy bark, and you don't often see it around here. But all these trees I'm talking about, you can see at the Arboretum. They do have them there.
And can we get them at local nurseries?
Yes, you can. There's tulip tree. That's an interesting one. And eastern beech, I've looked at that. It's an interesting tree. If you get any of these trees at the local nurseries, you want to get them from a local one, not some place where you write to in the south, because the seed source is important.
The hardiness is contained in the seed rather than in where the plant is grown. Because the hickory is, you think about that as a southern tree.
Right.
That's one you want to be especially careful of.
Right. Now, at the Arboretum, the oldest tree planted by the first director, Leon Snyder, is the shagbark hickory. He planted it in 1958, and it is a long 3-mile drive. And there's quite a few of them in there, but you can see them very easily. And then there's the cucumber magnolia. Are you familiar with that?
No. What is that?
It doesn't look like a cucumber.
Okay. Does the fruit look like a cucumber?
No. It has the flower. Most magnolias bloom very early before they get their foliage. Mm-hmm. The cucumber magnolia blooms in about June. It has a flower that looks like a water lily. It doesn't it doesn't stay and bloom too long, but most trees don't. So, but then as it develops into a seed pod, it gets almost like this deep red bag of seeds by the end of the summer.
Nancy, thank you for all this great information. We've been talking with Nancy Bjerke, who is a member of the Men's Garden Club of Minneapolis. She's a master gardener and a tree care advisor.
Oh.